It's May 2026, and the Russo-Ukrainian War is still ongoing, now in its fifth year. After the Russians were able to make some important gains in 2024 and 2025, the war has turned into a stalemate again, similar to the situation of 2023. Despite of the Russian victories, morale among Ukrainians and their allies is still high, so Russia's task won't get any easier in the next months and years. Today, we will look at the current situation in Ukraine, on the front line, economically and geopolitically. I'm Paul and this is Global Politics. Here is everything you need to know. First, make no mistake. Russia had and still has the advantage on the front line in Ukraine. This is shown by the Russian conquests of Ghulyai-Pole, Siversk, Pokrovsk and Mirnograd in 2025. In total, Russia conquered 4,831 square kilometers in the last year, the biggest number since 2022. This led some international observers to believe that the Russian advances would continue into 2026, and some even thought that they would increase. It is now April and we can say that this scenario as of right now hasn't turned out to be true, at least for the moment. The Ukrainian army was surprisingly able to slow Russian advances down, and even started some counterattacks at the border between Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk Oblast, where they were able to recapture some villages. Although many Russian military bloggers state that a Russian summer offensive will achieve further advances, it seems that this offensive already failed before it had even begun. According to reports, approximately 90% of Russian soldiers die in Ukraine before they even reach the front line. That is because Ukrainians have achieved a massive drone superiority over the last couple of months. FPV drones fly deep into occupied territories and strike the Russian invaders there before they can even pose a threat. If Russian soldiers eventually do reach the front line, they have to advance in storm units into the death zone, which is on average between 3 and 10 kilometers wide space between Ukrainian and Russian controlled areas. At the start of the war, this zone was only about 500 meters big, but due to the expanding drone warfare, it expanded drastically. Russian soldiers are sent into this kill zone in small groups and are given the task to infiltrate areas. Most of these soldiers have no success. There are just too many Ukrainian drones in the air and the chance of being spotted eventually by one is very high. The Russian storm units are mainly composed of raw recruits, who immediately get sent to the front line after entering military service, with no combat training whatsoever. They are nothing more than cannon fodder, people who have absolutely no value for the Russian regime. Recently published videos show Russian recruits who are barely able to stand because they are alcoholics or have a disability. For Russian soldiers in other units, where the life expectancy is higher, being sent to these storm units is one of the worst punishments they can get, comparable with death, because they face almost certain death there. If soldiers get caught with alcohol, drugs or smartphone, they get transferred to these battalions. In contrast, most Ukrainian soldiers are combat experienced from years of fighting. Ukrainian soldiers at the moment mostly stay sheltered in their positions and don't have to face the Russians face to face, as FPV drones do the job in the kill zone. It seems that Ukraine hasn't the resources to launch a large counteroffensive like in 2023 this year, but we can expect an increase in counterattacks throughout the year 2026. Russia has just one option to make further advances in Ukraine, and that option comes at a high risk. Russia theoretically could mobilize more troops in a general mobilization, maybe like the one in autumn of 2022. Maybe also on a bigger scale. But if Russia takes this step, it would face massive domestic problems. A mass exodus from the population can be expected, and Putin himself may be at risk of a possible revolution by the Russian people or a coup by his military. Putin knows that he needs to hide the war away from Moscow and St. Petersburg, because that's where the Russian elite oligarchs are. If the Russian state wants to take their sons for the war, internal unrest will start directly in Vladimir Putin's center of power. The greatest problem for Russia at the moment are the Ukrainian drone attacks on the industrial infrastructure. Ukrainian FPVs managed to attack the oil refinery in Tuapse twice and turned the city into a burning inferno. Other oil refineries were hit too, like in Ust-Luga, and the Russian oil export decreased significantly. The Kremlin has now declared a ceasefire for the 9th of May, when they celebrate their victory over Nazi Germany. Zelensky has declared that Ukraine was not contacted about this and therefore won't accept a ceasefire like this. He argued that Russia could also propose a permanent ceasefire. Why just for the 9th of May? It's obvious that Putin is scared of a Ukrainian drone attack on his parade, which is a huge humiliation for him. For the first time since 2007, the parade won't include armored vehicles and artillery. Only a few soldiers will march over the Red Square. International leaders mostly avoid the parade this time. Only the visits of Belarusian President Lukashenko, Kazakh President Tokayev, and Slovak President Fico are confirmed. It seems that the others who were there last time are too scared of an Ukrainian attack. In summary, after 2.5 years of sustained offensive by Russia, Ukraine can finally breathe a bit of fresh air and is back in a very strong position militarily. Similar to the military, the Russian economy is slowly starting to show cracks, although we are still very far away from a total economic collapse. However, on May the 2nd, CNN published a very interesting article about the economic situation. Quote, "However, the economy is beginning to show signs of creeping strain, with GDP contracting 1.8% in the first 2 months of 2026. Russian President Vladimir Putin acknowledged the issue in a government meeting on economic affairs in mid-April. Statistics show that economic growth has, unfortunately, been slowing for 2 consecutive months, Putin said, demanding officials explain why the trajectory of macroeconomic indicators is currently falling short of expectations." Unquote. There are multiple reasons for that. First, the international sanctions against Russia are starting to take effect. For years, Moscow tried to put up the facade that the sanctions do not affect the economy at all. And for a long time it seemed that they were right about this. Russia showed steady economic growth over the first years of the war, more than the countries who imposed sanctions, like Germany, for example. In year 5 of the Russo-Ukrainian War, it seems that Russia now finally has to face the harsh reality of international isolation. This recession comes at the worst possible moment for Russia, now that the war is turning into a critical phase. Ukraine's economy has also problems, but their financial budget is covered by the EU, who very recently passed another aid package which includes $90 billion for Kiev after Hungary and Slovakia lifted their veto. This will cover Ukraine's finances for at least the next 2 months, which is a huge advantage over Russia, which has to pay for its military equipment by itself. In contrast to Ukraine, Moscow has to pay for weapons from China, whereas Ukraine gets military support from Europe and America for free. All these factors show that the Ukrainian economy is currently in a better status than the Russian economy. And Russia can only fund its war in the future by changing completely to war economy. While Russia is mostly isolated internationally, Ukraine still gets strong support from the EU and NATO. Russia's ally number 1 in the EU, Viktor Orban, got voted out of office in the last elections in Hungary, where the people sent a very strong message towards Russia. Hungary's new Prime Minister Peter Magyar pledges to change Hungary's geopolitical stance on Russia and Ukraine and promised to support Ukraine with weapons and money. This election in Hungary was one of the biggest geopolitical disasters for Russia in the past years, comparable with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Iran can no longer support Russia with Shahid drones, as they need them for their own war against the United States and Israel. The only strong allies that continue to provide Russia with weapons are Belarus and North Korea. Especially North Korea even sent soldiers in 2024 to the Kursk region to help the Russians in driving out the Ukrainians out of Russian territory. In return, Russia had to pledge military assistance to North Korea in case of war, a pretty big concession for a few thousand unexperienced and poorly equipped North Korean soldiers. At the moment in May 2026, there are no North Korean soldiers still directly fighting in Ukraine, and Russia has to fight the war largely on its own. The most important geopolitical aspect of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2025 was the relationship between the US and Ukraine.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war,
you're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards.
Mr. President.
You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
After the White House scandal in April 2025, tensions between the two nations started to cool down. And it seems that Trump now understands that Putin doesn't want to end the war, as he provides Ukraine with key American intelligence information on Russian infrastructure, which Ukraine uses for its drone attacks. Joe Biden always refused to give these informations to Ukraine because he feared an escalation of the conflict. So it can be said that Ukraine is in a better geopolitical situation with Trump than with Joe Biden. The American weapon supply also continues. The difference is just that America doesn't give them away for free anymore. Washington sells these weapons to Europe, who give it to the Ukrainians. Aside from the fact that this burdens the European finances, for the Ukrainians it is pretty much the same situation. So the American help for Ukraine is, compared to what you hear in the mainstream media, still on a high level. It would be a huge overstatement to say that Ukraine is winning the war. This could not be further from the truth. But the situation got considerably better for the Ukrainians over the past couple of months. The war is a stalemate on the front line, and the Russian problems get bigger every single day. If the tide of the war continues in this direction, an acceptable peace for Ukraine could be on the horizon. Thank you everyone for watching this video. If you like my work, please like this video and subscribe to this channel, it would help me a lot. I will continue to monitor the situation in Ukraine and will update you every single week about the situation on the front line. This was Global Politics, see you next time, bye bye.